Hi everyone, my name is Hala Alyan. I'm a Palestinian American clinical psychologist and author that's based in Brooklyn. I was very excited to be asked by the Palestinian American Community Center to talk a little bit about mental health today. So I'm going to go through some questions. The first is, what are ways we can tackle the stigma of mental health in our Arab and Palestinian communities? This is a wonderful question. There continues to be a fair amount of stigma in our community, unfortunately. And I always want to be mindful of talking about this because I think there's a way in which we like it can be conceptualized that mental health standards um, originate from and should always be upheld by the West. That it's the psychotherapy is the ultimate golden standard for mental health and for healing. And at the end of the day, psychotherapy was a white and pretty middle class, upper middle class practice that was created for a certain community. And I think a lot of the work of people of color that work in this field is to sort of unlearn some of the things we were taught in school and kind of figure out how to make it applicable to our communities. The West does not have a monopoly on healing, and actually many of the concepts that you find within different traditions of psychotherapy actually have their roots in various parts of the world, in Buddhism, in indigenous healing practices. So I say that to say, like, mental health is something that's been addressed all over the world, including in our communities in different ways. At the same time, it is, I think, fruitful to speak to the limitations within different communities. And I think, one of the things that I'll speak from my own experience is that I certainly grew up in a house and in a culture where there was a lot of like, don't air your dirty laundry, don't talk about the stuff that happens that's difficult. And I think one of the biggest ways to start to work with that stigma is to encourage our children and our parents and our siblings. So encourage the generations that came before us and those that come after us to express themselves and to recognize that, like, there is no bad emotion, there's no good emotion, there's just a range of emotions, and every human experiences, almost every human on the planet experiences all of them at some point in their life. And I think one really beautiful way to start to work with stigma is to model for the people in our life that it's okay to be angry sometimes, it's okay to be sad sometimes, that sometimes people are going to grapple with depression, they're going to grapple with mental health issues, anxiety, etc. Um, I think bringing things out from the dark and starting to unpack the shame around having mental health issues is the first step to starting to dismantle some of that stigma. So really starting to think about ways that we can shift from like a model to more of a resilience and resource driven model of like, if I have a certain amount of capacity and another person doesn't, how can I gift some of that capacity or redistribute some of that emotional resources and model for people how to do things differently or to get through their life a little bit easier. Um, the second question is, why is tackling the stigma important, especially given our community's disproportionate relationship with war, trauma, and PTSD? And I think that question is an answer in and of itself. It's important because of the disproportionate relationship and proximity to war and trauma. I think that, the Palestinian community, whether in diaspora or in Palestine, are folks who have experienced a fair amount of displacement and dislocation and trauma and even honestly, even the generations, like even if, like, let's say your great 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 parents or great great grandparents moved here in 48, let's say, like, from that moment moved to the States, and you are now several generations American and you've never stepped foot on Palestinian soil. I still think, and that's the story of a lot of people in the diaspora, I still think that you probably have had some sort of proximity with trauma and dislocation, in that it's intergenerational and it passes down. So what affected your great grandparents affected your grandparents, affected your parents, and affected you in some way. These things, it is part of the lineage for good and sometimes in challenging ways. So I think it becomes particularly important to tackle the stigma around asking for help and getting services and getting treatment, because a lot of times we are in a community that really needs some of those services, and really needs some help in terms of tackling our um, relationship and proximity to trauma. We have an identity that is, in this country, contested and charged and comes with a lot of challenges. because of the political landscape here. And so that in and of itself is, that in and of itself comes, I don't think anyone listening to this who is Palestinian hasn't had experienced a major, like a ton of microaggressions at some point in their life. And that's to say nothing of experiencing more direct, like dislocation and violence, etc. What are resources that our community can utilize to help those struggling with mental health issues? Love this question. So I think that, so there's this website called psychologytoday.com, and you can go in there and they have a great filter search engine where you can put in your insurance and if you have it, and then you can put in your preference for language. So let's say if you're looking for someone who speaks Arabic, you can put in a preference for religion if you're referring to someone who's Christian, who's Muslim, who's whatever. Um, and then you get a range of clinicians who have that background. So I think that I would start there for people that are looking for services. People can also reach. I'm always happy to be a resource in trying to get creative to think of like connections for folks who are looking for services. There are often also depending on where you live. There are sometimes like I know Detroit has this. There are places in I think LA. New York has it. New York has like meaning centers that are specifically for certain backgrounds. So New York has like the family Arab American Family Support Center, masalan, and I think that they have similar things in big cities across the country. What are signs that someone may be struggling with a mental health issue? What are signs that this could be triggered by war, PTSD, or intergenerational trauma, and what would this look like? I mean, I think that it really depends. Some people who've experienced trauma or have PTSD shut down. Like PTSD is a disorder of either hyperarousal or hypoarousal, meaning like either people like, and sometimes people have both, and they just have it at different times. So it can manifest as people kind of being dissociated, being detached, distant from their experiences, um, feeling really numb, not really reacting when things happen, or it can manifest as hyperarousal. So that's like you hear a sound and you jump. Your psychosomatic system is very activated. Your nervous system is very activated. Your breathing is shallow. Your heart rate is really fast. You are more likely to go into an anxious response. And again, sometimes people have both ranges of them, but usually it can look like someone being triggered can literally look like a person getting really shut down and quiet and silent at a party, and it can look like somebody hyperventilating and having a panic attack, which is why I think it's really important to get good services and a good um, a professional clinician to help if you are struggling with some of the stuff, because you might be having symptoms or manifestations that don't see that you're not really flagging as potentially being connected to mental health conditions. Sorry, I got a quick interruption. Um, so yeah, so I think that you can have sort of a range of these symptoms without realizing that they're symptoms, which is why it's important if you feel like your functioning has changed, if you feel like your experience of the world has changed, if you feel like you're experiencing more joylessness and less enjoyment out of things that you used to enjoy. Usually those are like signs that it's probably a good idea to get a little bit of support. Um, in our community, anxiety and depression are more widespread than we actually acknowledge. What are some tactics we can implement to have more open conversations about this? I love it. I think, it can be both top down and bottom up. So, top down is institution. I think, to be totally honest with you, I think even this conversation and the fact that like Palestinian American Community Center asked these questions is like, this is an example of more of a top down approach where like an organization or an institution that's respected within the community is now having a conversation about mental health and including programming around mental health. That has a trickle down effect because that communicates to the members of the community that this is okay to talk about and, in fact, encouraged to talk about. And so I think it models for folks how to do that. I also think there's a bottom up approach, which is, one thing that I have done in the last few years is start to talk more openly with my parents and my grandparents before they passed away, Allah yarhamon, about like, when I struggle or what I learned in school about anxiety, and not in a accusatory way of like, you have it too, but just sort of like, these are things that I struggle with. And by doing that, go back to the thing we were talking about earlier, you're modeling for folks how to have difficult conversations around mental health and around mental health struggles. So I think really just like bringing things into the light and communication and just like talking about things, like being able to have conversations about these things are the most important. That's the most important thing that we can do. There aren't that many Arab American therapists, mental health professionals in our community. What would you say to people debating entering the field? Please do it. We need more people to refer to. I would say, only do it if it really resonates with you. I think this is this is like some of the most gratifying work of my life is to be a clinician and to work with these different communities. It's also hard and it's pretty intense and it takes a lot out of you and you have to be mindful of protecting your resource, like your energy reserves, and not overextending yourself and having boundaries, because otherwise you'll get burned out. And if you get burned out as a therapist, you're not going to be useful to anybody, much like least of all your clients. So it's a lot, but it's also incredibly gratifying for me to work within my community. So if you're thinking about it, I don't know. My instinct is to do it, but I would also say reach out to clinicians. Maybe the best advice I can say is reach out to other clinicians that are also either of your background or interested in doing similar work as you and ask them about their experience. And people can always reach out to me. I'm happy to be a resource in that way. Okay, 7. 2 more questions. Therapy is very important and a great way for people to solve many internal issues and help folks manage their mental health illnesses. However, many people think that, and then quote, I'm not crazy, I don't need therapy. What would you say to people who say that? I think it's not about being crazy or not crazy. It's not about needing therapy or not needing therapy. It's, does your life look the way you want it to look? And is there a certain is there an extent in that, in whatever your response is, that is within your control, right? So I could ask that question to a lot of people and they might be like, no, Hala, it doesn't look anything like I want it to look like, and also I have no control over this, right? A person could answer that question like, I'm currently in a refugee camp, I make $100 a month, I have to take care of a family of 5 people, I don't have any documentation, I don't have this, I don't have that. Okay, so then the control that the person has in that situation is different than somebody who has a fair amount of privilege and lives in like a wealthy Western city and has a fair amount of a nice paycheck and whatnot. The amount of control one has over their circumstances differs on the privilege spectrum. That doesn't mean that the person in the first example has no agency, because the one thing that we have agency over, most of us, I would say most people, is some degree of being able to decide how to react to our mental health and deciding how to react to. So we don't control our mental health. We don't control if we're depressed, but we do have a certain amount of agency, even if it's just a sliver of like, how do we react to the fact that I'm depressed? How do I react to my anxiety? And that sliver is like a muscle that can grow and grow and grow when you do therapy and you learn different coping skills. So I tell people to focus on the thing that they have agency over in their lives, and then think of therapy as the thing. It's like going to the gym to train your body. This is a way to train your mind and your emotional acumen so that you learn how to be able to be more resilient and flexible. What are qualities I should look for in a therapist? This is such a great question. I would say that, so I think the answer varies depending on the person, but I would say as a rule of thumb, ask yourself who are the people in your life in general that you feel most comfortable around, and then ask yourself what it is about them that make them that way. And then look for those traits in folks in your therapist, right? So if you're someone that actually responds really well to somebody taking charge and kind of like, being like, I got it, I'm handling it, you don't have to worry, I'm going to take care of it, more direct maybe, or directive, then maybe that's the kind of therapist you should be looking for. If having someone who is really warm and like cuddly and sweet and just like they're making you feel like everything you say is okay, then that should be something you're looking for. The best therapist, I'll be honest with you, I'm sorry, the best therapists are going to be people who have some combination of all of these things. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is like you will be able to find some range of all the stuff that you're looking for, but certainly look for people that are qualified, that are licensed. That should be like a note, like that definitely, that's like the bare minimum. And yeah, again, folks can always reach out to me if they have more questions about any of this. Thank you again so much for having me today. Bye.